In this fourth in the series of videos exploring characters in Sense and Sensibility, I want to probe rather randomly Mrs Jennings. As previously, you'll have two tasks to do. First, to pick out 5 moments in what she does, says or thinks is interesting, and then 5 quotations. We're going to go into loads of depth and come up with some rather unusual, interesting insights. So let's help you get a higher mark in your essay on Sense and Sensibility for A-level. Stay tuned, you're watching Schofield on Shakespeare. So here's the first task to get you thinking in more detail about Mrs Jennings. Consider her role in the novel and write down 5 moments in what she does, says or thinks is important to you and or interesting. No need to use quotations, just summarise each moment in a single sentence using your own words. So press pause now, the video will resume in 5 seconds time. Here's my list, starting with one of the moments in which vulgar, fun-loving Mrs Jennings can't resist teasing the Dashwood sisters amid speculation about possible future partners. Next up is her accosting of Willoughby and Marianne following their naughty trip to Allenham after the trip to Whitwell has been cancelled. Third, she gives an invitation to the Dashwood sisters to stay with her in London. Unusually, Marianne doesn't ignore her and suddenly becomes extraordinarily civil and enthusiastic. I wonder why. Next, another side to Mrs Jennings is seen in the humane, compassionate, tireless way she helps Eleanor look after Marianne during her illness. And finally, her response to the way Edward is brutally cut off by the Ferrarses following the revelation of his long-standing secret engagement to Lucy is well worth scrutinising. So let's explore these moments in more detail, starting with the narrator's description of her love of matchmaking and speculating about future relationships. Read this extract from chapter 8 of volume 1 and press pause. As ever, it's important to contextualise. Whereas in the 21st century, a mother of grown-up children with enough money not to work might decide to go on a cruise, do a degree, do some volunteer work, to name just a few possibilities. But there are far fewer possibilities towards the beginning of the 19th century. As a woman, Mrs Jennings would have been largely confined to the domestic sphere. She has neither intellectual curiosity or discipline enough to expand upon or develop the accomplishments acquired during her youth. So why shouldn't she get repeated enjoyment out of speculating about future relationships? Indeed, Austen's novels show that it isn't just older women who are obsessed by matchmaking. The heroine of Emma describes it superlatively as the greatest amusement in the world, and she, like Mrs Jennings, has her share of successes and failures. In chapter 1, it is revealed that she successfully engineered the relationship between her former governess, Miss Taylor, and the widower, Mr Weston. And returning to Sense and Sensibility, Mrs Jennings is spot on in discerning Colonel Brandon's feelings for Marianne, and of course the pair do marry at the very end of the novel. However, a key difference between Emma and Mrs Jennings is that the former is more sensitive and tuned to the boundaries of propriety, whereas the latter, along with her son-in-law Sir John Middleton, is shameless when it comes to teasing and getting active enjoyment out of blushes and embarrassment. Even before Mrs Jennings has any inkling about Eleanor's feelings for a man with a surname beginning with F, and even before Marianne has met Willoughby, she cannot resist crude, exploratory probes, which go beyond the boundaries of propriety and are, quite simply, rude. Marianne is particularly affronted by such blatant hunts for gossipy morsels, hence the use of the noun attacks. Although Eleanor's perspective is less extreme and more balanced, it is pretty normal for young women to be exposed to some jokes and speculation about their matrimonial prospects. And of course, Mrs Jennings is not to know that she has experienced difficult feelings in relation to Edward Ferrars. But of course, Marianne's metaphorical description of Mrs Jennings's teasing as attacks is not really accurate, for an attack is something done willfully and deliberately. If you attack, you mean to hurt. Mrs Jennings doesn't mean to hurt anyone. She just likes to have fun. As she does here, when she embarrasses Marianne and Willoughby about their furtive trip to the latter's probable future home. Read through the extract now and press pause. What is notable here is the lengths Mrs Jennings has gone to find out the information. She has got her own servant to speak to Mr Willoughby's servant to get all the goss. This is unquestionably undignified and ungenteel-like. But of course, Mrs Jennings doesn't give two hoots about that. As long as she acquires new snippets to gossip about, she is content. It's also important to stress that she is right when she labels Willoughby Mr Impudence and refers to the pair as having been up to tricks. What they have done is underhand, and Willoughby's behaviour, as well as his brazen attempt to only partially admit his offence, is disrespectful. To return to a passage from Jane Austen's World, which I also quoted in my video on Marianne, the pair are guilty, they have done wrong, and they are risking Marianne's honour in the process. So Marianne is blushing not just because of Mrs Jennings's crudeness, but because deep inside she knows travelling alone to Allenham with Willoughby whilst the pair are unengaged is likely to be viewed critically, in spite of later unconvincing protestations to Eleanor. But Mrs Jennings is not speaking as some indignant protectress of propriety determined to root out improper behaviour, but just as someone who is pleased with her successful detective work and determined to get a few laughs at the young person's expense. Eleanor, by contrast, treats the whole matter with far more gravitas. In my third moment, we join Marianne actually bothering to speak to Mrs Jennings. Here's her response to the kind, albeit rather insensitive, older woman's invitation to join them in London. Read it through now and press pause. Of course, this extract principally reveals the extent to which Marianne is obsessed with Willoughby. What she doesn't say explicitly but means is that the thought of being able to see him gives her the greatest happiness, not being in London per se, and especially not having to be based in a house with Mrs Jennings. But it's fascinating to read the narrator's overview of Marianne's attitude towards Mrs Jennings. She is always disgusted, repulsed by the older woman's manner. What do we make of this? Well, the adjective used to describe Marianne is fastidious, which means that she is particularly particular about how people should and shouldn't behave. One thing people shouldn't do is intrude upon or make jokes about other people's lives and relationships. So this quotation perhaps gives another example of Marianne's tendency for extremes. Either she loves or she despises. But given the close alignment between the narrator and Eleanor's perspective, it also implies some further criticism of Mrs Jennings's levity and fondness for gossip. Given the serious consequences for the majority of women if they don't manage to find an eligible husband within Austen's time, perhaps it is wrong for the smug to crassly josh and jest. Nonetheless, the importance of Mrs Jennings's offer to take the sisters to London cannot be overstated. Catherine Limmer gives an excellent overview of the difficulties for women when it came to travel within her essay Women and Mobility in Sense and Sensibility. Both cost and propriety hinder their ability to travel how and when they wish, and they find themselves once again dependent on the arrangement of characters whose wealth allows them to maintain independent means of travel. Standards of propriety demanded of single ladies meant they couldn't travel any distance unless accompanied by a suitable chaperone, and certainly not alone. Whereas Brandon may be able to dash off to London from Devon at the dash of a hat, and Willoughby to go the other way after hearing about Marianne's perilous state of health, women in Austen's time were largely stuck. Without Mrs Jennings's offer, there would be no way for Marianne to get to London, and thus within possible striking distance of man about town, John Willoughby. Indeed, their lack of a carriage means that they've hardly got to know anyone beyond Barton Park in Devonshire. Thus, the importance and kindness of Mrs Jennings's offer here cannot be overstated, particularly given the fact Marianne has largely ignored her, treated her with disinterest and disdain up until this point. So the previous extracts have painted Mrs Jennings as rather insensitive. This extract gives a different perspective. Marianne is seriously ill in Cleveland. Read it through now, pressing pause. Again, context is so important. Mrs Jennings' daughter, Charlotte Palmer, has just had a baby. You might expect Mrs Jennings' priority to be with them, but no, she says that she won't move one jot from Cleveland whilst Marianne is ill. And this results in Eleanor finally seeing the light about her. She may be clumsy, she may be indiscreet, but she is kind. And in a world housing the likes of John and Fanny Dashwood, Willoughby, Lucy Steele, this is a quality to be prized and cherished. To return to Maggie Lane's Jane Austen's world, one of the lessons that Marianne, and I would add Eleanor as well, has to learn is that a nosy, vulgar character like Mrs Jennings may actually possess genuine warmth of heart and be entitled to her respect and affection for that reason. Actually, Marianne is wrong when earlier in the novel she claims that Mrs Jennings is solely a voracious acquirer and devourer of gossip. As well as genuine kindness of heart, in some areas, those related to mothering and nursing, she is perceptive and of immense practical value. As Susan Morgan writes within Polite Lies, the veiled heroine of Sense and Sensibility, she becomes a delight to know because her character combines sound principles and a loving heart. And this is seen in her reaction to Edward being cut off by his family. Read through this extract, pressing pause. Note her welcome, no-nonsense, brusque dismissal of Fanny and Mrs Ferrers's ridiculous reaction to the news about Edward's secret engagements. She has no pity for either of them. Note also her mildly subversive comments about the fatuousness of those obsessed about marrying for money and class. Something unsurprising perhaps, given the fact her husband made his money in a low way, i.e. through trades. Juliet McMaster's comments on screen give an insight into the attitude towards those who seek to join the gentry after making their money through trade. The word has a ring that seems to require apology. Their money isn't quite respectable until it has aged a little. The assumption would be that a younger Mrs Jennings might have experienced some resistance and perhaps hostility to her and her husband's slow rise through the ranks. And so this may be an example of Mrs Jennings empathising with her younger counterparts as she disdains obsessive preoccupation with class and wealth. She also shows that she is a practical realist with her comment about the pair potentially being able to survive on £500 a year. She vigorously contradicts Colonel Brandon's assertion about the impossibility of Edward and Lucy being able to survive on the living provided by the Delaford parsonage. And indeed, her figure of 500 a year can fill the cup of human happiness, at least according to the domestic economist quoted in Edward Copeland's chapter on money. So throughout the novel, there is a shift from viewing Mrs Jennings as a loud, fat chatterbox to someone of genuine substance and warmth. When she openly criticised the ghastly female Ferrers, we all cry, hurrah! Let's move on. In the exam, you'll need to be able to wheel out actual quotations given very specific individual insights. So it's time for your second task. Reread sections of the novel before writing out 5 quotations which give different insight into what Mrs Jennings is really like. In order to ensure that you are revising as much of the novel as possible, avoid quotations or sections of the text which have been used so far in this video. Press pause now to get started. Here's my first quotation. Colonel Brandon has just announced mysteriously that he has to head to London at once, thus causing a great deal of disappointment to those assembled, already unpacked to head to Whitwell. Mrs Jennings hectors. "If you would but let us know what your business is," said Mrs Jennings, "we might see whether it could be put off or not." This line makes me laugh, as it combines 2 aspects of Mrs Jennings's character in one fell swoop. Firstly, we have the insatiable appetite for gossip. She, more than anyone else, is desperate to know what juicy event may have occurred, which has meant that Brandon has to dash off at once. And secondly, we see the disregard for propriety. It is clearly inappropriate for her, a woman, to question a male friend of the family about his private business. And earlier in the exchange, we saw Lady Middleton's characteristically futile attempt to rein her mother in this regard. But Mrs Jennings doesn't care about whether what she says may be deemed offensive. She just wants to get to the bottom of the mysterious business as quickly as possible. My second quotation is taken from the same chapter. Undeterred by Colonel Brandon's polite refusal to give any information at all about why he needs to rush off to London, Mrs Jennings resorts to her favourite hobby of speculating and gossiping. She guesses, correctly in fact, that Brandon has had to leave because of some business relating to Miss Williams, and here introduces the name to Eleanor. Then, lowering her voice a little, she said to Eleanor, "She is his natural daughter." Mrs Jennings's relish and enjoyment of tittle-tattle can be gleaned from the pause and the anticipatory lowering of her voice. However, accuracy is of secondary importance to gratification, and Mrs Jennings is not accurate when she says that Eliza is Colonel Brandon's natural daughter. Eliza is actually the daughter of his childhood sweetheart, who went on rather tragically to marry his brother. Mrs Jennings's indiscriminate nature is seen here in her selection of Eleanor as the recipient of her confidences. Eleanor is the last person in the world who wants to gossip and be burdened with other people's private stories. She is no Emma. But Mrs Jennings is not sufficiently perceptive to pick up on this. She simply exudes goodwill, and anyone nearby is likely to be on the receiving end of her occasionally ill-judged, rather insensitive, half-accurate disclosures. Her no-nonsense honesty refreshes. "Well, I was young once, but I never was very handsome. Worse luck for me." That said, it is much easier to make these kinds of proclamations once the business of getting married, and also marrying off your daughters, is long complete. Such honesty and plain speaking is also seen in this quotation, in which Mrs Jennings enrages against Willoughby's mistreatment of Marianne. "Well," said I, "all I can say is that if this be true, he has used a young lady of my acquaintance abominably ill, and I wish with all my soul his wife may plague his heart out." Her kind-hearted loyalty and fury is seen in the use of the adverb abominably. She feels Marianne has been used abominably ill, and the unusually vehement verb plague. There is a more obvious reference to Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet in Emma, when Emma paraphrases Romeo's words to the apothecary in order to highlight the perilousness of Jane Fairfax's situation. Nonetheless, the verb plague is so striking that it likewise seems to echo Shakespeare's play, and Mercutio's haunting curse on both the Montague and Capulet families prior to his death. Mrs Jennings is powerfully calling for Willoughby's new wife to make his life an absolute misery, to blister him, to cause him sustained long-term heartache and anxiety. This is a cry from the heart that shows her unflinching loyalty to a young woman who, up until this point, has not really deserved it. In my final quotation, though, I want to return to the point that Mrs Jennings is not always that bright. Maybe that's a little unfair, that Mrs Jennings is not the most emotionally intelligent out there. Colonel Brandon has found out that Willoughby has ditched Marianne, and so Mrs Jennings imagines that he should be overjoyed. She had watched them with pleasure while they were talking, and who expected to see the effect of Miss Dashwood's communication in such an instantaneous gaiety on Colonel Brandon's side as might have become a man in the bloom of youth, of hope and happiness, and saw him with amazement remain the whole evening more serious and thoughtful than usual. But of course, true love trumps naked self-interest, and the reason Brandon is more serious and thoughtful than usual is because he knows how much Marianne has suffered due to her rejected love, and he truly cares about her. At this point, he is simply worried about her health, her person, her mind, and holding thoughts of supplanting Willoughby in her affections are inappropriate at this stage. Mrs Jennings just doesn't get this sensitivity, doesn't get the depth of feeling from either Marianne or Colonel Brandon. Thus, she is amazed. But this is unlikely to stem her customary good spirits and light-hearted speculations for more than a few seconds.
It looks like we've come to the end of this video exploring character within Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. I hope it's been useful. Many thanks for watching.